Oil prices are falling again, and this time it's OPEC Plus that's to blame. After holding back production for over a year, the group has now restored more than 2 million barrels of oil per day since April 25. The latest increase adds another 137,000 barrels per day, just enough to push prices lower. For Russia, that's a serious problem. Its budget depends heavily on oil income, and every dollar drop in price costs billions in lost revenue. As OPEC Plus turns the tap back on, the world's oil gets cheaper, but Moscow faces yet another financial hit. In this video, I'll break down how OPEC Plus's strategy is shaking the oil markets, driving prices down, and squeezing the Russian economy. Welcome back to the channel. As you've just heard, OPEC Plus has once again increased the amount of oil that its nations are producing and putting out into the global markets. Now, OPEC Plus is a consortium of different oil producing countries that come together and decide on how much oil will be put into the markets. And the reason that they were doing this historically was to try to control the price. They were limiting the amount of oil to try to keep prices high. But over the last 12 months, that policy has been reversed, and OPEC Plus is now actually increasing the amount of oil, which obviously has a detrimental impact on oil prices. They go down. So from a consumer's point of view, that's good news. But if you're a big oil producing country such as Russia, a fall in oil prices is going to hurt your revenues. Now, just in terms of who's in OPEC Plus, well, it was originally just called OPEC, and there are 13 member countries that were originally in just OPEC, and they are Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Algeria, Libya, Nigeria, Gabon, Congo, Venezuela, Indonesia, and Equatorial Guinea. And they were joined by 10 more countries to make it OPEC Plus. And the biggest one of those was Russia, as well as Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Oman, Sudan, South Sudan, Malaysia, Bahrain, and Mexico. So those 23 countries make up OPEC Plus, and they come together on a regular basis to decide how much oil is going to be sold. Now, back in 2023, OPEC Plus decided that it was going to cut oil production significantly. It actually took 2.2 million barrels per day out of global production. And the reason why it did that was because it wanted to push prices higher. At that time, prices had started drifting down, and so OPEC Plus thought that cutting production would make them more profit, but that didn't quite work out as they were hoping. And in terms of which countries agreed to cut back on their production, well, the biggest one, the leader of OPEC Plus, is Saudi Arabia. They agreed to cut 1 million barrels per day from their global supply. Russia was the second biggest. They cut 471,000. Now, interestingly, at that time, Russia was struggling in terms of being able to find enough buyers and also had some production issues. So there may have been an ulterior motive as to why Russia agreed to such a big cut at that point. It might not just have been because it wanted to keep oil prices high. Iraq cut by 220,000, United Arab Emirates 163,000, Kuwait 135, and then there were a bunch of other countries that gave a total of 211,000. Now, as I've said, if we have a look at oil prices, those cuts were made in 2023. But if we look at what's happened to oil prices over the past 5 years, you can see that there was an uplift in 2023 in the second half. We saw prices increasing from around about $75 per barrel to just under $90. However, that didn't last very long. And what OPEC Plus realised was that those cuts weren't really giving it the desired effect. What they wanted was prices to go back up to over $100 per barrel, but that simply didn't happen. So what we're now seeing is OPEC Plus have been unwinding all of those production cuts over the last 6 months or so. So you can see that in April of 25, it was announced that there was going to be an increase of 138,000 barrels per day. They followed that up in May with an increase of 411,000. There was another increase of 411,000 in June and July. In August, we saw the biggest single increase, 548,000 barrels per day. In September, it was 281,000. In October, it's 137,000. And it's been announced that in November, there will be an additional 137,000 barrels of oil per day released back into the global markets. So as you can see, the cumulative impact of these increases has been an increase in global supply of just under 2.5 million barrels per day. Now that compares to the cut of 2.2. So actually, OPEC Plus has increased on a net basis, even if you take into account the cuts that were made back in 2023. So as I said at the beginning of the video, that's good news for consumers, because when we see an increase in the supply of anything, simple economics tells us that the price is likely to go down as long as demand stays stable. And if we have a look at what's been happening to oil prices over the last 12 months, as OPEC Plus has been increasing the amount of oil in the global markets, you can see that it's been going down. So 12 months ago, the price of a barrel of oil was sitting at somewhere between $75 and $80. We saw it spike at the beginning of 2025 when Donald Trump came into power, and there was a lot of uncertainty in the global markets as to what was happening. And it actually rose up above $80 per barrel. But since that time, we have seen almost a consistent fall in the price of oil. And currently it's sitting at around $66 per barrel. Now, this is the chart for Brent crude oil. This isn't the chart for Russian Urals oil. Urals oil trades at a discount to Brent crude because of the sanctions that are in place. Russia has to offer a better deal to encourage countries like China and India to take large volumes. But the trend is exactly the same for Urals oil. And if we have a look at what's been happening over the past 5 years, you can see that prior to the war in Ukraine, prices had been drifting up. In 2021, they were down to $40 per barrel. Now, obviously, that was affected by the COVID-19 pandemic when demand for oil globally was at an all-time low. But after 2021, we saw prices rising steadily. And just before the war started, they were sitting at somewhere around $80 per barrel. Immediately following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they spiked well above $100, but that only lasted for a few months. And by the end of 2022, we saw prices back down to around $80. But over the last 3 years, we have seen prices coming down. And this isn't good news from Russia's point of view, because it's one of the biggest exporters of oil globally. And basically, if the price goes down, it will make less profit, because the oil industry is a high fixed cost industry. You've got a lot of costs that you have to cover. And so pumping out as much oil as possible and getting as much for each barrel makes you more profit. If the price comes down, your fixed costs remain fixed. They don't move. But all it means is that your margins start to be eroded. And that's what's happening to Russia right now. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because clearly what's going on with oil prices is absolutely critical to the Russian economy. We've talked about it many times before, but oil and gas revenues contribute somewhere around 30% of total GDP for Russia. So it's important that it maintains all of that income and that profitability. And the price of oil is a major factor in terms of how much cash and profit Russia has. When prices are high, it means demand is high or supply is short, and Russia will benefit from that. However, when supply starts to increase, simple economics always tells us that price will go down. And that's exactly what we've seen over the past 12 months. OPEC Plus has suddenly changed its strategy. In the past, it was trying to preserve the price of oil by restricting the supply and therefore maximizing its profit margins. However, Saudi Arabia, who's the leader of OPEC Plus, has seen that many of the countries who signed up to the cuts in 2023 weren't actually abiding by those quotas. They were actually selling more into the international markets than they were allowed to because the price was better, and so they wanted to make a bit more money for themselves. So in order to punish the other members of OPEC Plus, Saudi Arabia has decided that it's now going to abandon that strategy of cutting back on production, and it wants to get those million barrels of oil per day that it agreed to cut back into the markets. So as a result of that, we've seen prices coming down, and the global price of oil is now sitting at around $65 per barrel. And that's bad news for Russia, because I'm currently working on a video talking about Russia's budget for 2026. And in that budget, the Kremlin has assumed an average price for Russian oil of $70 per barrel. Now, if the global price of Brent crude oil is sitting at $65, that means that Urals oil will be trading closer to $60 per barrel. So clearly, Russia will be undershooting on its budgets, and it's actually budgeting a huge deficit of around 1.3% of GDP. So obviously, if the global price of oil comes down, then the deficit will increase. And actually, the new price cap that was put into place recently from the most recent round of sanctions is now on a floating basis. So it's set at 15% below the global price of oil. So if the global price of oil is sitting at $65, then the cap is going to be somewhere around 55, maybe as low as $50. So that's going to hurt the Russian economy, and it's nowhere near the $70 that Russia has budgeted. So the falling price of oil is really bad news for Russia at a time when it's also struggling with the drone strikes that Ukraine is now targeting on all of the oil and gas facilities in Russia. I talked about it in a recent video, but Russia's oil refining capacity is down by around 40% against its maximum, and it's actually now having to import oil. I'm working on a separate video about that, so please watch out for that coming out soon. So all of this is extremely bad news for Russia at a time when the economy is already struggling, growth has slowed significantly. The switch to the wartime economy is now starting to hurt the Russian economy in terms of the lack of reinvestment into industry and growth. So it's now stagnating, and falling oil prices is going to make the situation worse. And as we know, Russia has been using its national wealth fund to fund its losses. And if oil prices continue going down, those losses will increase, and that wealth fund will not last forever. In fact, it's probably only got somewhere between 12 and 18 months to run before Russia runs dry. So this all means really bad news for Russia and the Russian economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't done so already. I'm trying to push my subscriber numbers because it really helps me with the algorithm. So please do that if you haven't. And thank you so much to everyone that's supported me, particularly everyone that came over to Patreon recently, where you can watch my videos advert-free, and you'll also be able to see them earlier than they're posted on YouTube. You can get that as well through YouTube membership if you're interested. Not so much on the adverts, but certainly the early access to my videos. But thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.